In the early years of the motet, all of the texts were Latin liturgy, and motets could be used for any part of the Mass besides the Credo. But as time passed, motets became part of the church ritual rather than the actual Mass. At first, the text for the motetus and the triplum were tropes of the tenor text, very similar to how the discant clausula would be written. However, over time, the upper voices were fitted to new texts with a related theme. So rather than actually taking pieces of the text from the tenor, they would choose a completely new line of poetry or a line from the Bible and fit it to the motetus or the triplum. Secular motets, on the other hand, simply grabbed the cantus firmi, or the tenor, from a well-known tune, usually either Gregorian chant or possibly even popular dance or troubadour song that was popular at the time. A typical motet would often have a liturgical text from the Bible in the tenor and bawdy French poetry in the upper voices. As the text for the upper voices became more secular, it became common for the tenor, which was generally still taken from Gregorian chant, to be performed instrumentally rather than vocally, which makes a lot of sense to me because honestly, having these French texts about love and revelry and running around all over the place, and then having a tenor that's just the Gloria or something that's obviously from the Bible, it just doesn't mesh very well, at least in my brain, and I guess in the medieval times that kind of felt the same way. But the cool thing about having the tenor performed instrumentally is that, in a sense, it became predecessor to the solo, the duet, and the trio. Because if you take a double motet, where you've got the duplum and the tenor, and then the tenor is played on an instrument, you've only got one voice. So it's in a sense a solo. Same thing with a three-voice motet, where the tenor is played instrumentally, that would be a duet, and then a four-voice with an instrumental tenor would sound like a trio with a composed accompaniment. So, historians have speculated that that's where the idea came from, and I think that's pretty cool. Their manner of pairing texts, the secular versus the sacred, just kind of all mixed up together, may seem irreverent and odd to the modern listener, but the composers actually took great care in attempting to maintain a connection between the thought behind the texts. For example, you might have a tenor that spoke of love for the Virgin Mary, and then upper voices that explain or speak about love for a mortal woman. Alternatively, the liturgical text could be about Easter, and the upper voices would be about spring. Modern listener usually draws a line between these categories and sees them as distinct, but the medieval man could make the connection right away without a second thought. The jump from the Virgin Mary to being in love with your wife was apparently just right next to each other. So, since we haven't lived in the medieval culture, it's hard for us to really yet understand the music the same way that medieval man would. But despite the fact that medieval man could easily make a mental connection between the resurrection and springtime revelry, motets with such obvious discrepancies or body themes were most likely never played or sung in church, which makes a lot of sense. Poetry used in motets was usually not of very high quality. The texts were full of imagery, alliteration, stereotyped expressions and images, and extravagant rhyme schemes. As the French secular motet developed, the motetus and triplum took on different moods. Usually a love song, when it was performed for events and stuff. The motetus was often the voice of a contemplative or disappointed lover. It was slower in tempo than the triplum, and not as important melodically. The triplum, on the other hand, was usually a merry ditty, faster in tempo, and speaking about the joys rather than the sorrows of love. As the lines became less connected textually, composers thought other ways to link the lines together. Early motets had upper parts written in one melodic and rhythmic style, but a new kind of motet surfaced, where composers distinguished the upper voices from each other as well as from the tenor. This kind of motet was called a Franconian motet, after Franco of Cologne. Franconian motets are characterized by a longer text in the triplum than in the motetus, and usually the triplum has a faster moving melody with many short notes. Adam de la Halle is one of the only composers in the 13th century with whose works we are familiar. His motet, De Madame Vient du Comment pour Omne, is the most famous of his compositions. And so Hall was a master at combining outside sources to create a multi-layered composition that made his works intellectually appealing. In this motet, Hall borrowed from a variety of sources. So we're going to listen to it in a minute, but first I would like to explain it. And so if you guys have your Norton anthology, if you could open to, let's see here, which page is it on? It should be right after the Factus Est. And so if you could just look at it real quick while I explain this, it'll make a lot more sense. So the tenor uses the melisma on omnis from the gradual viderunt omnes, just transposed down a fifth, but Hall gave the melody a distinct rhythmic pattern that he restates 4 times. So it's a 4-measure rhythmic pattern that he repeats 4 times in measures 1 through 16. And then he repeats the same process twice, picking a new rhythmic pattern for measures 17 through 32, and then a third rhythmic pattern for 33 through 48. So if you look at the score, it's pretty easy to see that. In the motetus, or the duplum, it begins with the refrain from Adam's own monophonic rondo, De Comment pour, that is transposed, and it closes with another borrowed refrain from somebody else's song. And the triplum also quotes several lines of borrowed poetry from other songs. It's all in your Norton anthology. It has italics where the borrowed stuff is. And so if you want to follow along with that, and then go ahead, I have a YouTube link for this. So go and listen to that. The whole song, it's not terribly long. It's about 2 minutes. And so if you could listen to the whole thing, that would be excellent.